All right, well, I think I'm glad I pulled the extra tables out. Awesome, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Joshua, Director of the Center for Research on Learning and Technology, and we're happy to have you here for our second session of the year. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Miller, who is a research associate for data science education at the Concord Consortium, and her research covers student and teacher learning within professional development on and implementation for data literacy and data science education across disciplinary boundaries and age groups. She has experience working across the field of science education as a teacher, teacher educator, curriculum developer, and education researcher in both formal and informal settings. So she's done it all. Before her doctorate, Kate worked as a senior manager of curriculum and teaching at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And prior to that, as a high school physics teacher, where she tells us she tortured her students by moving all the way around the room, including standing in the back, looking over their shoulders. So feel free to use that technique on your own. Kate has a PhD from University of Pennsylvania, where she definitely met Cindy on a few occasions, and a MA in Science Education from Teachers College. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you for reading my lovely bio, Joshua. He was like, I'm going to read your bio. And I was like, I do not remember what's in that. So thank you all for coming. As Josh said, my name is Kate, and I work at the Concord Consortium. So just to start out, how many of you have heard of the Concord Consortium? Okay, a handful, excellent. So we are a nonprofit education organization based out of Concord, Massachusetts, is where our offices are, although about half of us work remotely. And we focus on research, development, and design for STEM education and digital and data literacy. So our primary mission is innovate and inspire equitable, large-scale improvements in teaching and learning through technology and data literacy. And we do this through research and also through development of technological tools for students. So if you have heard of any of these tools, these are from the Concord Consortium. And if you haven't, I suggest either after my talk or later in the afternoon, you Google CodeApp if you're at all interested in data exploration and data literacy. It is our sort of biggest and most well-known tool. And it is a free open source browser-based data analysis tool, which has sort of been designed specifically for teaching and data exploration. The main target students were 4th grade through sort of 10th grade when we were designing it, but I know some researchers and teachers that have worked with it with students as young as 2nd grade, and I know a lot of people who use it with college students as well. So within Concord Consortium's sort of main mission and goals, my primary focus, as Joshua said, is that I focus on data science education and data literacy. And so really looking at teaching, teachers, and sort of how students learn data literacy in the classroom. So data literacy. As probably most of you know at this point, data literacy is becoming a pretty big topic in a lot of different fields of education research. And it's, sort of becoming more and more vital for students to learn as the world becomes more awash in data and big data, and students are constantly encountering it, having it collected on them, seeing different news sources and things like that are using it. And so just, thinking about how we can prepare students for sort of existing and thriving in a world where data is everywhere and can be both a source of bias, but also a source of power. So the way that I think about data literacy, and I will tell you that I will probably use data literacy, data science education, data fluency, data acumen, all interchangeably in my talk. I am not married to any one of those, and the different projects that I've worked on have used different versions of that. So I apologize if I'm just sort of flipping in between them. But at the end of the talk, I will talk a little bit more about how we're as a field trying to hone in on how we're talking about that. But I really think of data science education, data literacy as being an interdisciplinary field that brings in technology and sort of knowledge of tools and how to use tools and technology to work with data. The mathematical piece, the quantitative reasoning that brings in statistics and math and sort of those statistical functions and equations and ways of thinking, probabilistic thinking, and then an authentic context. And so content knowledge from the field that the data is coming from, whether that's, biology, science, social studies, history, art, whatever that field is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 projects that I have worked on. The first one is a couple of years old. The second one, we are literally just wrapping, so I have some preliminary data I can share with you, but nothing too deep yet. And then the third one is one that we are very much in the middle of, so I'll share some ongoing work on that. So the first, towards an understanding of PCK for data literacy. To start this out, I'm going to again dive a little bit into my background as Josh did, just to ground sort of how I came into data literacy and started thinking about it. So my sort of first step in the route in here was that I was actually an astrophysics major as an undergrad. Thought I wanted to be an astrophysics researcher. Went through undergrad and realized that I really enjoyed talking about science and astrophysics and reading about it and didn't really love doing research on it. So instead, I got a teaching degree and went into the classroom and became a high school physics teacher. And so I did that at a public school in Brooklyn for 5 years, teaching freshman physics and IB, International Baccalaureate Physics to juniors and seniors. And then from there, as Joshua said, I went to the American Museum of Natural History. And so that's really where I started thinking a lot more about preparing teachers and thinking about how teachers are working in the classroom. That's also where I started thinking much more outside the box of sort of the standard classroom learning of like what is in your physics curriculum. Because at AMNH, we did sociology, anthropology, we did astrophysics, right? We taught a lot of these courses that were sort of outside the typical middle school, high school course catalog. And it was there that I decided that if I wanted to keep teaching teachers and sort of working with them and learning them, that I did actually have to do some research. And so I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania. And so there I was working with an advisor, some of you might know, Dr. Susan Yoon, who focuses primarily on science teacher education, which is, what I sort of came into this field really wanting to do. I had been a science teacher myself. I had worked with a lot of science teachers at the museum. And so I was really interested in thinking about how we can better prepare science teachers to sort of do more sort of hands-on and more relevant work with their students. So one of the first projects that one of the big projects that I was working on at Penn with Dr. Yoon was what we called K-12 bioinformatics. And this is really the story about how I became focused on data literacy and data science ed. So this project was, the goal was to bring bioinformatics into high school science classrooms. So we had a bioinformatics unit that we developed, designed, that involved students collecting air quality data using these little mobile devices that we built in our lab that collected air quality data on particulate matter, on CO2, temperature, humidity. I think there was one other one potentially that I'm forgetting. And the goal was for students to use these mobile devices to collect their own data and to get this big data set of, data from their school, from their neighborhood, and really think about how the air quality in these spaces that they inhabit might be affecting theirs and others' lives. And so we designed this unit. We ran professional development for the teachers to support them in teaching it. with all of the sort of traditional high quality PD pieces. They went through the entire unit as students. We gave them lots of support. We gave them in-classroom support. We did an extended PLC throughout the year. And the results were somewhat mixed. They definitely grew in their confidence for teaching data literacy. So as we were thinking, we didn't come into this project thinking about it specifically as a data literacy project. We came into it thinking about it as a bioinformatics project, and it was really grounded in bioinformatics and science. We were actually partnering with the health, the medicine, the medical group at Penn partnered with us in this to bring bioinformatics into the classrooms. And so the sort of data piece, we found that teachers really grew in confidence, that, you know, they were sort of more excited about doing it, but that they were definitely still struggling. And we really sort of figured out that the data literacy piece was a real barrier for the teachers. And that was a little bit unexpected because these were high school science teachers. You know, they were already teaching biology and or environmental science. And so we were a little bit surprised that they felt discomfort with the data literacy piece. But it became very clear through the first few years of doing this project that they did. You know, as you can see, one of our first teachers here, as far as the statistics and relating that to that real research, and teaching our students, I think that I was a little bit unprepared or underprepared for that. And, you know, a note from our external evaluator, one person brought up that there is a gap between content knowledge and pedagogical skills, and that the teachers are really feeling that and recognizing that. So this is what led to my dissertation research, which focused on addressing the disconnect. So really thinking about pedagogical content knowledge, specifically for data literacy. So if any of you are in the world of teacher education for science, you might recognize this. This is the refined consensus model that was developed by a whole team of science teacher educators in PCK, like about 5 years ago, that sort of maps out pedagogical content knowledge and how it fits into the larger scope of teacher knowledge and what teachers know and need to do. And one of the important pieces is that around PCK is obviously subject matter knowledge. And so what we were thinking about is, okay, if you're doing data and data literacy and data practices in the classroom, what actually is that subject matter knowledge that you need? It might not just be the science knowledge for your classroom, but it also includes some of this technological knowledge and some of this mathematical knowledge, right? Going back to that, the 3 circles that I showed about, you know, where data literacy fits. So this was my dissertation research, was really thinking about, like, what is this PCK? And I started from a place of, so for PCK research, there is sort of especially in the science realm of PCK research, there's this fairly well accepted breakdown that there are these 5 components of PCK: orientation to teaching, knowledge of student understanding, knowledge of curriculum, knowledge of assessment, and knowledge of instructional strategies. And so I basically applied all of these to data literacy and thinking about, like, what are some of the components of this. If we're focusing specifically on data literacy and data science as that content piece that the teachers need. And so some important things are, you know, like, this does not work on a screen like this. Knowledge of data sets, right? Really understanding the data set that they're working with. What are the activities and representations? What are students' preconceptions about data? So I went into this really trying to better understand what the components of PCK for data literacy are. And I specifically went into this with 4 experienced high school science teachers. And so it was not just growing their PCK, but also trying to understand, like, what PCK did they already have, but just not know how to articulate, or how to sort of reflect on in a way to improve it or make it better. And then through the PD, how did we support teachers' development? So I designed an extra treatment so that, you know, as I said, the teachers have been going through this PD for the bioinformatics unit. So I took these 4 teachers and I did an extra external sort of extra treatment for them, specifically looking at PCK. And really dug into within this, developing big ideas around data science and data literacy. And then cores are content representations and video reflections of their work. So content representations, this is the template. John Lochran and colleagues developed it a while ago. It's been used in a number of different projects for sort of helping teachers to really surface their meta-knowledge about teaching in the classroom. So as they're designing a lesson plan, what are those sort of meta-knowledge pieces? And then the video reflections. So actually videotaping their classrooms, having them watch it and watch their colleagues and really reflect on, what are the strategies that are being used in the classroom. So we did that. These were my dissertation participants. This is Philadelphia Public Schools. And I will say, as a sort of disclaimer for this project, that this research was done in the 2021-2022 school year, which for Philadelphia high school teachers was their very first time back in the classroom with students after almost a year and a half of being remote. So Philadelphia public schools closed in March of 2020, and the high schools did not reopen until September of 2021. So I had some teachers who were teaching 10th graders who had not been in a classroom since partway through their 8th grade year. So there was like a lot going on externally to this work, but we did what we could in working with the students, and the teachers were all fantastic and just really wonderful, very experienced teachers, as you can see. Just quick data analysis. Most of my work is qualitative, so I do a lot of sort of, constant comparative coding for a lot of the work that I'm doing right now. So for this project, I sort of started to build out this map of PCK for data literacy, and identified 17 components of PCK, and those were sort of within this orientation to teaching, knowledge of students, and knowledge of sort of strategies for teaching. 3 that are of particular interest, and then I'll show some examples of the data for, is that we really found that students have a fear of numbers and that their conception of data is constrained. And so that is sort of a really important piece of teacher knowledge that you need to know and have in order to engage students with data literacy in the classroom. And that one strategy for addressing that is to think about ways to make data tangible for them. So here are some just quotes by the teachers talking about this fact, right? Like the math phobia. Students feel stupid around numbers, and their numeracy comfort is just not on grade level. So, and thinking about like, if you don't know what data is, then, and if you think, right, it's just numbers and you have this fear of numbers, then doing data literacy is going to be alienating. So within our work with those teachers, we were really thinking about like, what are some strategies to make data more tangible, to try and get students to think about it not just as numbers. And so some of these they actually did try in the classroom. Some of them were just sort of ideas that we were throwing around as ways to think about this. But we were looking at air quality, so this idea, and we actually had a teacher that tried this. It didn't work great, so she was thinking about ways to do it differently in the future, but using like white felt or something and putting it out and stapling it outside so students could see the colors change of the pollution. And then, doing something unrelated to that, but just like physical, kinesthetic with the students to get them thinking about how data is not just numbers, it's connected to something sort of real. So those were sort of the learnings for PCK, and then around the actual PD and development of PCK, we found that talking about the big ideas was a really foundational component of this, because the teachers were not used to thinking about data literacy as an actual like subject matter that needed to be taught explicitly. These were all science teachers and they were used to doing it, but they weren't used to thinking about it as something that needs to be explicitly taught. They always thought of it as a tool to teach another piece of content rather than as something that, like I said, needs to be explicitly talked about. So working on these big ideas. And then the content representations really helped to guideline the discussion and reflection, which made sense because that's what they were built for, and really just gave the teachers a language to use to talk about their skills in the classroom so that they could focus in on them. And then the video reflections, again, really sort of helped, I think, the teachers, particularly their confidence, their self-efficacy grow, because they got to see each other teach. And that was not something that classroom teachers get to do very often, is see other teachers teach, especially not teachers that are teaching literally the same thing they are. And so they got to really see both the things that their coworkers were doing well, but also the things that their coworkers were struggling with, that they were like, oh, I'm not the only one that this is challenging for in the classroom. Like, my students are not the only ones that are, can't do these certain things, or are struggling to learn these certain things. So from this, some of the big takeaways were that science teachers actually already hold a lot of knowledge about data literacy, but they sort of need this time in scaffolding to really think about how to explicitly teach it. And this piece about learning goals for data literacy in K-12 classrooms and the big ideas of data literacy really need to be solidified is something that is going to come up later in my talk. So from this dissertation research, I moved to Concord and really got a chance to step outside my comfort zone of science teachers. And the first project that I was working on there was going back to this, and saying, okay, this authentic context, what if that's not science? What if it's instead middle school social studies? So this project is one that we literally just wrapped. So we have some preliminary findings, but we're still very much in the data analysis piece, but centering data and project-based learning. So what we did for this project was we actually focused on social studies and thinking about social studies as a disciplinary context for doing data literacy practices. And social studies sort of promotes this knowledge of involvement in civic affairs. And so if you think about data literacy as being this really important piece of existing in the world and thinking about the sort of share of power and who has power and how they use it, it makes total sense that data literacy would fit really well into a social studies classroom. So for this project, we were really looking at how do specifically middle school social studies teachers integrate data practices into an interdisciplinary project-based learning curriculum. And then how do students tell interdisciplinary stories with data, and how does that develop their data literacy, specifically data agency and data identity. So for this project, we were only working with 2 teachers, but they were in pretty different contexts. So one, our first teacher here was teaching 8th grade social studies in New York City, in Washington Heights neighborhood, which, if you know, is primarily Dominican American. So a lot of her students were either themselves immigrants or their direct family members were immigrants to this country. And so that was the particular context for her classroom. The other teacher was teaching both social studies and ELA in a large block humanities schedule in Columbus, Ohio. And just over 90% of her students were Black, and had, their families had been living in the Columbus, Ohio for generations. So the context for this project, we were working with a curriculum company called EL Education, which develops ELA modules that are project-based learning modules around specific books. So the 8th grade ELA curriculum for EL Education has 4 books in it. Each one of them, they read the book and then they do a project based on the book. And the 2 books that are in the 8th grade curriculum that most closely fit with the social studies content were the book Farewell to Manzanar, which is a story about the Japanese incarceration camps in the US during World War II. And then the second book was Omnivore's Dilemma. And they did We co-designed with the teachers, and so year one, they only did the farewell to Manzanar, and all of the data that I have to share is all from year one, so I don't have the omnivore's dilemma data here, but in the second year, they did omnivore's dilemma as well. And so within that ELA module, they were reading the book. That was all happening in the English classroom. In the social studies classroom, the two teachers worked to design a unit that would sort of go alongside what the students were doing in ELA. And so that included looking at a bunch of data sets. This data set here, this is from CODAP, is the data set of all of, actually, I think it's just a sample. Yeah, this one's got a sample because it's only 1,000 cases of the Manzanar intake form for the Manzanar camp. So this has all of the information that was recorded about each person as they arrived at the Manzanar camp. And you'll notice here, the very first person in this list is Jean Wakasuki, who is the author of Farewell to Manzanar. And so the students actually got a chance to dig into this data set, explore it, and sort of look at that data set alongside what they were reading in the book. So as I said, we co-designed with teachers. So we had a co-design team that included our two awesome classroom teachers, our data science education experts from Concord, and then the EL PBL module expert. And we developed some sort of guides for our co-design process, which really started with centering teacher voice. And, you know, we let the teachers really guide this work and sort of decide where in their social studies curriculum it made the most sense to fit this work. Other than the Manzanar data set, which was a fairly obvious one, we let them give us a lot of feedback about what other data sets they were interested in bringing into the classroom. And the lesson and module design process was very iterative, with a lot of sort of passing back and forth and feedback and co-planning time. So for sort of an initial look, thinking about the teachers and the teacher learning here, we noticed that our teachers really focused on sort of making the process authentic to their students. So even down to the point of that module that aligned with Farewell to Manzanar, actually choosing a different driving question in terms of how they were bringing it to their students. So for the New York City teacher, who again teaches students and children of immigrants, really focused the unit around the driving question of who gets to be an American. And then the teacher who works in Columbus, Ohio, with mostly Black students, the driving question was whose voices are heard in literature. So again, both taking that Farewell to Manzanar book, bringing it into social studies, but framing it differently for their different audiences. So the New York City teacher used historical immigration data from Ellis Island and Angel Island and current migration ICE detention data, detention centers data, along with the Manzanar data set to really dig into that question. And the Columbus, Ohio teacher had additional sort of interviews with that were conducted years after the Manzanar camp with the internees that had been there. And then some data sets on banned books. And then she actually conducted a community survey with her students and her students' families around sort of the relevance of different books to their lives. So sort of, again, very preliminary, thinking about the PCK sort of developed and used by the teachers in this study. And this is something that, this is literally just pulling stuff, haven't done any deep coding yet. But thinking about in terms of how we're approaching teaching this to students, making sure that the data sets are related to students' lived experiences, as you can see by the choices made by those two different teachers. Really emphasizing the humanistic nature of data in social studies. So for a lot of the data sets that they were using, the case was a person. And, you know, making that very clear to students, right? Like, what do all these data points actually mean? Like, each of these data points is a person. And sort of really humanizing the data, and then making space for the student agency. And this was something that the teachers definitely struggled with, was like really the data sets that the students were working with were large, like over 1,000 cases and multiple attributes. And so really giving the students some choice in how they explored those data sets. And then for the student learning, we rely primarily on this framework from Josh Radinsky about data storytelling, that there are these pieces to data storytelling, telling a story about oneself, animating a data representation, so sort of talking about data representation and explaining it, and then incorporating data into extant narratives. And so for our sake, that was primarily the book that the students were reading and how it was connecting to the text. And then sort of on the larger scale, narrating oneself into a larger data represented world. So again, preliminary coding and results here, but this is an example of one of the students' data stories that they built inside CodeApp with a tool that's built into CodeApp called Story Builder, where you can actually basically create a kind of interactive slide deck almost inside CodeApp. And so the students used that to build a data story about the Manzanar data set. So this student explored how the length of staying in the camp might relate to the number of people that died. And so, you know, we have started coding some of these and sort of thinking about how these different components, right, of this sort of data storytelling are coming into the stories that the students are telling. So we're hopefully going to be publishing on this in the coming year, but we're still working on it. And then, so these are, again, preliminary results just from year one, but we did a retrospective post-survey with the students. So at the end of the year, the students were asked to reflect basically on their own learning, the questions that, like, you know, I used to, and now I. So the students themselves were actually sort of assessing how much they had grown or changed in these areas. And we saw for data identity, some really great growth for the students. I see myself as a data person, went up. Interestingly, I see myself as a math person, did not. So, you know, whatever that comparison is, that is potentially a hint that they were sort of starting to separate data from math.
How many students?
So this is, I'm trying to remember year one, this was like 80 students. Yeah. And so, yeah, the year two data, we have another 80 students in that. And then the data agency, sort of, again, thinking about, I am capable of explaining and defending my data. So students seeing themselves as capable of doing this work. All right, so implications so far for this project. Again, as I said, we're still working on the data analysis, but this sort of interdisciplinary project-based learning can really support data fluency and build student identity and agency, and that the teachers can engage in these teaching data practices. Again, this project, we were really only working with these two social studies teachers, so it was a very small project. The teachers themselves were part of the co-design. They were given a lot of support. And so the next step for this project is to try and expand that work and to hopefully work with a much larger number of teachers. We also want to expand down into the 6th and 7th grade classrooms with the same type of design work. Okay, so given all of this, data literacy is a very big field right now. And the last two projects that I talked about here were sort of very focused in on small groups of teachers, very specific projects. The first one I was working with 4 high school science teachers, this one 2 middle school social studies teachers. However, data literacy is a big buzzword in education right now. It is being picked up all over the country. And so another thing that we've been working on is we've been working really closely with Data Science for Everyone. If you are interested in working on data science and data literacy and you don't know this organization, you definitely should. They are another nonprofit out of the University of Chicago, really working on data science and data literacy policy across the US. So as you can see, this was updated as at the end of last year. So there are more states that are working on this year. But we already have a whole bunch of states that have added a course to their state course catalog specifically for data science. So like a data science course. And then we have already a handful of states that are working on standards or a framework for adoption for data science and data literacy. So given this, we realized that schools, districts, teachers are all kind of running ahead of the research on this. And so there's a real sort of need and opportunity here to really think about how we are defining and talking about data literacy. So over the last 10 years, there's been some work building on this. 2017, Concord hosted Data Science Education Technology Conference. In 2019, the IDSSP framework was released. 2020, the GAZE 2 framework came out, which is statistical education guidelines. And then in 2022, Foundations of Data Science for Students in grades K through 12. That happened actually just as I came onto Concord, so I was not a part, but a bunch of my colleagues were. And then in 2023, last year, there was a the Data Science and Literacy Act was introduced in Congress. And then this year, I forgot to put that on here, there was a joint statement released by all of the teacher practitioner networks, including CSTA, NSTA, NCTM, and SSA, Social Studies, and I'm forgetting at least one, about the importance of data literacy in the classroom. So this all led to, so alongside all of that, there's also been a lot of work happening in pockets, sort of trying to define like what exactly is data literacy, science, fluency, ACUM, including the GAZE framework, the IDDSP framework. There's a nonprofit called DataSpire that's been working on data literacy essential ideas. The EDC has been working on it. This is Holly Lynn's lovely cycle for data investigation processes. So there's been a lot of work happening on this. And so basically, it's all kind of been happening in pockets. So we decided that this was a really ripe time to think about building learning progressions for data science education. So Concord Consortium and Data Science for Everyone put in a joint proposal to NSF to launch an NSF workshop. It was a conference proposal, but it got us going. So in October of 2023, we gathered about 30 of sort of the biggest name researchers in data science education. We got them all together in person. We made them sit down and work together in person for 3 days. And we drafted some strands of learning for data science education, and we started to draft progressions for data science education. And so that was the start of this whole project. We launched, like I said, in October of last year. Since then, we have been sort of working to both get input from the larger field and also socialize the idea of learning progressions for data science education. So throughout the first half of this year, January through June, we ran a series of 11 focus groups that all met multiple times and were asked to really think about the answer to the question, if there was an end of high school exam in data science education in the year 2030, what should be on it? And that was sort of all that we gave these focus groups. And then we let them really think about, okay, like what should be on it? And they went through multiple rounds of like brainstorming a whole list of things and then voting on them to figure out priorities. And so we had these 11 groups, including 4 groups of teachers and we, like I said, have been partnering with each of these organizations. So NCTM, NSTA, NCSS, and CSTA to bring together these groups of teachers. We also had some state subject leads for our policy group. We had people from industry, all thinking about this same idea. And they all built this, they voted on it, and in June of this past year, we had everybody come together and sort of present what they had come up with across those different focus groups. And I'm not going to get into that because it was a lot. But one of the things that did come out of that was a revision of our original strands and some identities of substrands. So this is sort of the current working, and again, this is all, like I said, still in progress, description of strands and substrands for data science education. So given all of that and all of the like many different competencies and ideas and all of this that had come from our focus groups, we again got a big group of experts together, most of the same people from the last October with some changes based on availability and things like that. And we really went into a writing sprint. And so this happened last month. This is very, very raw. So I would not even there. So much wording and editing needs to happen still. But the idea is that we've identified, like I said, these 5 strands, and across these 18, I don't remember how many substrands. And then I started to identify what the data concepts are. So within each of the substrands, there are a series of data concepts. Each of those data concepts stretches in a learning progression. We have 5 buckets of grade levels. We're doing K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So each of these data concepts has then competencies that stretch from the K2 up to the 11, 12. This is the current state of it. It's a mess. We are working on it. We are very much in the writing and editing process right now, but we are sort of trying to build, research references into this that will be part of the final release of this work. So next steps for this learning progressions work, and again, this has all been done in this joint effort between the Concord Consortium and Data Science for Everyone. So for the next few months, we have a team of people that is going to take this and turn it into something that is actually readable with, common language and, is organized and all of that. And then we have a team, we have a website designer that's going to come in and help us build the website, with the idea being that the website will be interactive and sort of have these different layers where you can look at the strands and substrands and then sort of zoom in and to look at the concept. And then eventually, a couple of years down the road, we will have resources and things like that connected to this as well. And the goal is to launch the learning progressions at the upcoming inaugural DSC K-12 conference. And the goal for this, in our dream world, is that we would do starting in the 2026 conference, do a pre-conference workshop that will be devoted to sort of reflecting on and potentially revising these learning progressions every year so that it's a real ongoing process and they don't get too out of date. So those are those sort of 3 big projects that are kind of telling the story about how I've been working on and thinking about data literacy and data science education, a few other ongoing and future projects. This project just launched. So this is a project that I'm a co-PI on at Middle State, Tennessee. And we are designing a teacher leaders in data science education program within their teacher leadership program at MTSU. So we just got our funding. We won't have our first cohort of teachers coming in until fall of 2025. But the goal here is to bring in a bunch of practicing teachers who are coming in to get a Master's Plus program as teacher leaders, but as part of that, they're also taking data science education courses, data literacy courses, both in the content and in the pedagogical content knowledge for how to do that. And then I also have a project right now called Data in Space and Time that we've just started, which is really thinking about how students engage with data that changes in both space and time, so spatiotemporal data. And we're developing some tools sort of explicitly for students to explore. This tool does not exist yet. This is just the UI design. But we are really thinking about the idea behind this cube is that this is a space-time cube. So lat and long are on the X and Y, and then time is on the Z. And so thinking about something like hurricanes and when and where hurricanes are occurring and being able to really see patterns in those 3 dimensions of 2-dimensional space plus time. So hopefully that will be something I'll be able to demo in the future, but it's not done yet. And then really some of where I'm going next is to circle back around now that we have will have by next year, the learning progressions, circling back around to the teacher PCK and thinking about how we can align that with those learning progressions. So now that we have the learning progressions and we sort of know what those data concepts are, those data practices and skills, what do teachers know or need to know in order to be able to actually teach them? And so connecting and building the PCK back on top of those learning progressions. And then this is just a resource that Concord has developed that if you guys are interested in data science education work, you should check out, because it is an Airtable database that has all of the people that are doing research in data science education and all of the articles that have been published on K-12 data science education. So that's just a little plug for another side project that I work on when I have time. All right, thank you. Question. Yes.
Simple question. This was with the two classrooms, the one in New York and the one in Ohio, I think it was.
Columbus, yeah.
I can't remember if you stated exactly why those questions were framed differently.
Yeah, so again, yeah, we co-designed these with the teachers, and so we gave them a lot of freedom to make it work for their classrooms. So this was the teachers decided this, and we sort of gave them the option to design a unit together or not. Like, we were not like, you have to teach the same unit. And so some of the they worked together on sort of pieces of it, and some of the lessons were very much the same. But basically, they decided in those conversations that in terms of what their students were going to be most interested in, even though they were both teaching 8th grade social studies, so they had the same sort of, although in different states, so I think they were slightly different, but they both basically Common Core stuff for social studies. But they made the decision that for their students and their group of students that they knew, they wanted to frame the sort of Manzanar piece differently. The teacher in Columbus, Ohio, like, none of her students were immigrants. That was not a big thing for them, whereas it was a huge thing for the teacher in New York City. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm very interested in data science education, and my current population I can access right now are the pre-service teachers.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, just from your perspective, what kind of big takeaways for the pre-service teachers, and what are some possible challenges that you might think of when introducing data science to pre-service teachers, because they are still in the process of building their PCK?
Yeah, I mean, I think for pre-service teachers, a lot of it is similar, honestly, to in-service teachers. It's really getting them to think about data literacy as something that needs to be explicitly taught rather than just as a tool to teach the content that they want to teach. So you can't just give students a data set and then tell them to ask a question. You have to sort of scaffold, like, how do I ask a good question of a data set? And you have to sort of prep them to think about the different types of data and, how they can use those different types of data. So I think a lot of teachers are not necessarily used to thinking about it that way. They're used to thinking about it as a tool to get to their content material rather than as something that needs to be taught itself. And so I think that's probably a really vitally important step for framing it for teachers. And also, just massive plug, I would use CodeApp because it's awesome. And just really limits the barriers for engagement in terms of learning how to work with data sets. And I'm happy to do a demo for the people I already talked to earlier got one, but if others want one later. Yeah.
How is the student's voice being incorporated? For example, did you have any, or were there any student focus groups?
For the learning progression.
Yeah, or in general, how do students come adding their voice to this?
Yeah, so for this project, the students were given a lot of agency in terms of for the final projects and things like that. They could ask their own questions of the data set. So this, is one question, but we had students who were bringing in their own background as immigrants and, thinking about that and talking about that in there. For the Who Wants to Be American, the New York City, the final project was actually, they designed an infographic that was answering that question about who gets to be an American. And so, as I said, they were looking at data sets about historical immigration through Ellis Island versus Angel Island, but also current immigration data sets and sort of ICE detention centers. And in New York City, Rikers is actually one of the largest ICE detention centers in the country. And so that was really interesting for those students and for some of them sort of bringing in their, Dominican backgrounds and their experience with immigration. And similarly for the Columbus class, whose voices are heard in literature, obviously they don't read nearly as many Black voices in their English classes as they do white. And so that was a big point of conversation there for them bringing in their own. And then for the learning progressions work, honestly, we have not been bringing in high school students yet. We did, one of our focus groups was with undergrads. So we did do a focus group with undergraduate students. But we brought in the teacher voices for this one, and we're hoping that once we have the beta release, in our years of, so I don't know that I talked about this, the original ones that we're working on now are very content agnostic, and then the goal is once those are released next year and into the following year, we're going back to these groups, NCTM and NSTA, to sort of build some writing teams for subject articulation. So really going through the learning progressions and saying, okay, what does this look like in a math class? What does this look like in a science class? What does this look like in a social studies class? So I don't know at what point we'll potentially, after we did these focus groups, they, like I said, developed a whole massive list of competencies that they all voted on to create some priorities. And we took, I think, the top 50 or so of those, and we did a public period where we actually had a survey open that anyone could fill out to vote on them the same way that these groups did. So we had a number of parents fill out that survey. We did have some high school students fill it out. So we've been trying to bring their voices in, but that's definitely something that we'll have to figure out more going forward, is how do we get the reflection from the actual K-12 students on this work.
I really enjoyed this presentation. Very nice. Thanks for all this details. Just wanted to comment on the, I think, data practices or data literacy as a maybe disciplinary or multidisciplinary context. So, I mean, you emphasize that, for a pre-service teacher or even for a teacher, this needs to be thought as a subject matter itself. But coming from, let's say, maybe elementary pre-service teachers or in-service teachers who are focusing on, mathematics, English. So for them to see the connections, now this adds another subject, right? And for them to really incorporate this, they don't need to see the relevance. But do you see this data literacy not just as a individual subject, but maybe in multidisciplinary context?
Yes,
you refer to the social studies as that.
Yep.
But I'm talking about data literacy.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I really think about data literacy as being interdisciplinary itself. Sort of really requiring not just the context, but also the math and the technology pieces built in. And when you're thinking about there is the quantitative reasoning, right? You have to kind of know how to work with data. There's the technology piece, especially when you're working with actual authentic data, it's not 20 cases, it's hundreds or thousands. So you can't do that by hand, you need technology. And I think thing that's been interesting working both with science teachers and social studies teachers is that the social studies teachers, when bringing data and data science into their classroom, they need the most support here and here, right? They're super solid here. The science teachers, though they're solid on science, they don't necessarily have the sort of civic piece. So when you're looking at authentic data sets, and this even came up in the bioinformatics project as they were talking about the different neighborhoods where they were collecting air quality data and connecting it to the socioeconomic data for those areas. Science teachers, at least many of the ones I have worked with, are less comfortable with those conversations about this is real world stuff, right? Oftentimes socio-demographic, the people that are involved with this data is important. And so it is definitely always interdisciplinary. It's yes, the technology and the math when you're in social studies, but even when you're in science and you're already used to the technology and the math, there is that sort of civic responsibility piece that almost always comes in when you're working with authentic data. And that is one of our learning progression data concepts, actually, is really looking at that. So one of our you'll see here, not only do we have the nature of data, which is really thinking about like the humanistic nature of data and the idea that data has variability, but there's entire substrand on ethics and responsibility in the learning progressions as well. Yes, Joshua.
So I'm jealous. One of the challenges we've had putting some data viz in history and ELA classrooms is that teachers didn't even think data was a thing relevant to their discipline. So even using data as a tool for understanding their discipline feels like a big accomplishment, but it sounds like you have them already doing that, and we're moving to the next step of building data literacy. So yeah, I wonder how.
Yeah, our social studies teachers were not using data in their classrooms before they started this project. This was brand new to them. And I think, so it's not like we took social studies teachers that were already using data and we're really focusing on the data literacy. It was all coming together. And I think one thing that has worked really well with at least the 2 social studies teachers that I've worked with, and sort of as I've been talking to others to bring into projects, is thinking about a data set as a text. You know, like it's just another primary source. And I think if you can frame it that way for them and get them to think about it that way, the same way that you do text analysis on a primary source that's a text, you can do basically the same process on a data set. You know, the same questions about like, who collected this data? What were they trying to do with this data? Who's left out? Who's, you know, like all of those questions that you often ask about a primary source that's a text are the same questions that you can ask about a data set. And so I and other people I know that have been working in the social studies space with data sets have had a lot of success really framing it that way for social studies and English teachers.
Yeah, so actually we've had the same success or similar success. I guess that where we're running into a bit of a challenge maybe is the sort of transfer out, where I think the kids and the teachers definitely see it as in history, yeah, we want to know the source of this. But I'm not sure that kids would think, I want to know the source of everything on the internet too. So I wonder, is that something y'all are thinking about, or is it good enough that it's working in history, or do you have the magic secret sauce?
I don't have the magic secret sauce yet, unfortunately, no. But yes, that's something to think about, you know, and we did, you know, ask questions about like, do you imagine yourself using data in other classes now, you know, and the students were like, yeah, maybe. You know, so there's definitely been some, like we're trying to measure for that, but we don't necessarily have anything, right? Like I take initiative in using data to support my learning in school. But we don't yet really have a way to, or have not focused on measuring how they're transferring it outside of the particular courses that they're doing it in.
So you're a perfect example of moving from your teaching to your PhD and then into Concord. On behalf of our graduate and PhD students, you saw they're not that familiar with Concord Consortium.
Yeah.
It's one of, you know, maybe a dozen or so really, you know, phenomenal places for recent graduates. So I wonder what advice do you have for the PhD students based on your experience in terms of trajectories and, you know, how do they go about landing? You know, this is wonderful work you're doing, and I'm sure that they're very envious of where you've gotten yourself so quickly.
So, you know, I was telling some of the graduate students that I was meeting with earlier is that I got very, very lucky with this process. And so, you know, there are a number of sort of nonprofit organizations that do this kind of work. Concord is one of them. The EDC is another. Digital Promise is another. Turk is another. You know, so I think step one is like getting to know all of these different places, know what they are, know what they do, and then seek them out at conferences. How I got my job was that I was presenting on my dissertation research at a conference. I think it was ISLS, when ISLS was virtual, or it might have been Cadre, I don't remember. But anyway, one of these conferences, And I was presenting at it, and the CEO, president of Concord, came to my talk. Because I had already done a whole bunch of research into this, I immediately recognized his name, and I was like, oh, hey, I want to talk to that guy. And I like reached out. It was all on Zoom and everything. You know, at the end of the talk, I was basically like, hey, I'd love to work for you. And he was like, great, here's my secretary's email. Sent an email, set up a meeting with him. We chatted for like an hour about my dissertation research. He was basically like, this is super cool. Let me know when you're done. So a year and a half later, I did, you know, I reached out and I was like, hey, like I'm defending my dissertation. You know, I'm still really interested in working for your company. And that I just got super lucky and the timing really worked out. And he was basically like, great, give me 3 months. And he had a job for me. So it is not always that easy. I don't want to make it sound like it's that easy. I got incredibly lucky. But again, like knowing all of these places and really sort of trying to do the research and digging into it, and finding the organizations that are doing, you know, work that is what you're interested in doing, looking those people up, knowing who they are, and making the connections, either by cold calling, but you know, if you can attend a talk or something that they're doing at a conference, that's always a good place to start.
Awesome, great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but hopefully folks can get for lunch. And thank you again for joining.